The saga began, as all suburban nightmares do, with a moving truck. A rusty, slightly past its prime U-Haul lumbered into the pristine, Stepford wife-approved cul-de-sac of Pleasant Hollow Estates. Pleasant Hollow, mind you, was so pleasant it made Prozac look like black coffee. Every lawn was a perfectly manicured putting green, every house a carbon copy of the next, and every resident seemingly cloned from a batch of perpetually smiling, beige-wearing robots. And then came Jack. Jack wasn't beige. Jack wasn't smiling. And Jack, bless his cotton socks, definitely wasn't a robot. He was a veteran, a grizzled old cuss who'd seen more action in his big toe than most folks saw in their entire lives. Years of service had earned him a Purple Heart, a pension that barely covered the cost of prune juice, and a titanium hip that set off every metal detector within a 5-mile radius. Oh, and a wheelchair. A sturdy, no-nonsense, I've seen some shit kind of wheelchair. He'd bought the dinky little bungalow at the end of the street with what was left of his savings. After years of bouncing from one sterile VA hospital to another, he just wanted a quiet place to call his own. A place where he could sip his lukewarm tea, yell at the squirrels in peace, and maybe, just maybe, forget about the shrapnel still lodged somewhere near his left kidney. Enter Karen. Karen, the undisputed queen bee of Pleasant Hollow. President, CEO, and supreme dictator of the Homeowners Association, HOA. A woman whose natural habitat was a meticulously organized binder, whose weapon of choice was passive-aggressive emails, and whose life's mission was to ensure that every blade of grass in Pleasant Hollow was exactly 2.5 inches tall. Karen saw the U-Haul pull up and her perfectly coiffed blonde hair practically stood on end. New blood, an unknown variable, a potential threat to the delicate ecosystem of beige conformity she'd worked so hard to cultivate. She peered through her lace curtains, her eyes narrowed like a hawk spotting a field mouse. And then she saw Jack. Or rather, she saw the wheelchair. A vein throbbed in her forehead. This was not in the brochure. This was not part of the Pleasant Hollow master plan. This was a curb ramp waiting to happen. The next morning, before Jack even had a chance to unpack his collection of vintage war movies, the first volley was fired. A crisp, white envelope, embossed with the Pleasant Hollow HOA logo, landed on his doorstep. "Welcome to Pleasant Hollow Estates," the letter chirped, in the same saccharine tone a Disney princess uses to ask a villain if they need help finding their way. "We are so thrilled to have you join our community. Please take a moment to familiarize yourself with our covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC and RS, which are essential for maintaining the beauty and harmony of our neighborhood." Attached were approximately 78 pages of rules and regulations, written in a font so small it could only be read with an electron microscope. Jack squinted at the document, his eyes glazing over after the first paragraph. He gathered, however, that Pleasant Hollow had rules for everything. The color of your mailbox, the type of flowers you could plant, the acceptable volume of birdsong emanating from your property. He half expected to find a clause dictating the precise angle at which you were allowed to tilt your head while watering your petunias. But the real fun began when Jack started making modifications to his house. He needed a ramp for his wheelchair, wider doorways, grab bars in the bathroom, the usual stuff. He figured he'd just get it done, no big deal. He'd dealt with bigger bureaucratic nightmares in the Army than a suburban HOA. He was wrong. So wrong. The second letter arrived 3 days later, this one less chirpy, more accusatory. "Dear Mr. Jack," it began, "it has come to our attention that you are making unauthorized alterations to your property. According to Section 4, Subsection B, Paragraph 12 of the CC and RS, all exterior modifications must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee, ARC, prior to commencement." Attached was a highlighted excerpt from the CC and RS, underlined in red ink so violently it practically bled onto the page. Jack sighed. He called the HOA, bracing himself for the inevitable Karen encounter. "Pleasant Hollow Estates. This is Karen. How may I direct your call?" Her voice was like nails on a chalkboard, coated in a thin veneer of condescending sweetness. "Hi, Karen. This is Jack. I just moved into number 13. I'm calling about the renovations I'm doing to my house." "Ah, yes, the renovations. Karen said, her voice dripping with disapproval. I'm afraid those are in violation of several of our community guidelines. The ramp, for instance. It simply doesn't conform to the aesthetic standards of Pleasant Hollow. But I need the ramp, Jack explained, trying to keep the exasperation out of his voice. I'm in a wheelchair. There was a pause. A long, pregnant pause, filled with the unspoken judgment of 1,000 beige-clad souls. Well, Mr. Jack, we all have our challenges. But that doesn't give you the right to compromise the property values of your neighbors. And that, my friends, was the opening salvo in what would become an all-out war. A war between a wheelchair-bound veteran and a HOA tyrant. The seeds of revenge were sown. Jack, a man who'd faced down enemy fire, was now ready to face down the greatest threat he'd ever encountered. Suburban bureaucracy. He knew, deep down, that this wasn't just about a ramp. This was about principle. This was about standing up to tyranny, one meticulously manicured lawn at a time. And Jack, God bless him, was just the man to do it. The cease and desist letter from Karen and the HOA landed on Jack's doorstep like a bureaucratic landmine. It was a masterpiece of legalese, a twisted symphony of CC&R citations and thinly veiled threats about fines, liens, and the potential public shaming that awaited anyone who dared to deviate from Pleasant Hollow's beige-tinted vision of perfection. Jack stared at the letter, a wry smile creeping across his face. He'd faced down IEDs in Kandahar, dodged sniper fire in Sarajevo, and endured countless lectures from drill sergeants who made Attila the Hun look like a kindly kindergarten teacher. A few strongly worded paragraphs from a suburban HOA wasn't going to scare him. It just pissed him off. All right, Karen, he muttered, rolling his wheelchair towards his dusty old computer. Let's see if you can handle a little legal jujitsu. He spent the next few hours hunched over his keyboard, navigating the labyrinthine world of legal websites and online forums. He dug up federal laws, state statutes, and even a few obscure Supreme Court decisions that seemed to vaguely support his right to live in his own damn house without being harassed by a bunch of landscaping fascists. He discovered the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA, a glorious piece of legislation that basically told Karen and her HOA to go pound sand. The ADA mandated reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities, meaning they couldn't discriminate against him or prevent him from making necessary modifications to his home. Armed with this newfound legal ammunition, Jack decided to call in the big guns. A lawyer. He found one, a scrappy, no-nonsense attorney named Sarah, who specialized in disability rights cases. Sarah had a reputation for taking on the big guys and winning, and she had a particular disdain for HOAs, which she considered to be dens of petty tyranny and architectural fascism. So, let me get this straight, Sarah said, after Jack explained his situation over the phone. This HOA is giving you grief because you need a ramp to get into your own house? That's the gist of it, Jack replied. They say it doesn't conform to the aesthetic standards of the neighborhood. Sarah snorted. Aesthetic standards? We're talking about basic human rights here, not interior decorating tips. Don't worry, Mr. Jack. We're going to make these folks wish they'd never heard of the word curb ramp. And so the legal battle began. Sarah fired off a scorching letter to the HOA, citing the ADA, state laws, and a long list of court cases that supported Jack's right to make the necessary modifications to his home. She demanded that they immediately cease and desist their harassment and approve his renovation plans. Karen, of course, didn't back down. Instead, she doubled down. She called an emergency meeting of the HOA board, where she presented her case against Jack in a dramatic, PowerPoint-fueled presentation that would have made Steve Jobs weep with envy. We cannot allow this man to destroy the integrity of our community, Karen declared, her voice trembling with righteous indignation. If we give in to his demands, where will it end? Will we have to allow people to paint their houses purple? Will we have to tolerate, gasp, unapproved shrubbery? The HOA board, a collection of equally beige individuals who lived in constant fear of Karen's wrath, unanimously voted to reject Jack's renovation plans and fight him tooth and nail. The battle lines were drawn. It was Jack and Sarah against Karen and the Beige Brigade. Meanwhile, Jack wasn't just sitting around waiting for the legal system to grind its gears. He was plotting his own little acts of revenge, subtle acts of rebellion designed to drive Karen absolutely bonkers. He started by accidentally leaving his trash cans out on the wrong day, resulting in a sternly worded letter from Karen about the proper disposal of refuse. He responded by placing a small, strategically positioned gnome on his front lawn, a gnome that was slightly taller than the HOA-approved height limit for lawn ornaments. He also took up a new hobby, playing polka music at top volume from his open windows at precisely 7 a.m. on Saturday mornings, the hour when Karen liked to do her power walk around the neighborhood. The look on her face as she passed his house, her perfectly coiffed hair slightly askew and her teeth clenched in silent fury, was priceless. But Jack's most diabolical act of revenge involved squirrels. He started feeding them, copiously. He'd scatter handfuls of peanuts on his lawn every morning, attracting a veritable army of furry, bushy-tailed rodents. The squirrels, emboldened by Jack's generosity, soon began wreaking havoc on the meticulously manicured lawns of Pleasant Hollow. They dug up flower beds, chewed on sprinkler systems, and even started building nests in the perfectly symmetrical hedges that lined Karen's property. Karen was livid. She declared war on the squirrels, setting out traps, spraying repellent, and even hiring a professional pest control company. But the squirrels, fueled by Jack's endless supply of peanuts, were relentless. They were a furry, four-legged force of nature, and they were determined to make Karen's life a living hell. The HOA issued a new rule banning the feeding of wildlife, but Jack cleverly circumvented it by claiming he was supporting local wildlife rehabilitation efforts, and that the peanuts were prescribed by his doctor to combat a rare form of squirrel-related anxiety. The neighborhood was in chaos. The perfectly manicured lawns were under siege. The HOA was in meltdown mode, and Jack, sitting on his porch, sipping his tea and watching the squirrels run amok, couldn't help but smile. The legal battle between Jack and the HOA was turning into a full-blown suburban circus. Sarah, Jack's lawyer, was a whirlwind of legal motions and sharp-tongued press releases, painting Karen and the HOA as heartless, discriminatory villains who were trying to deny a disabled veteran his basic rights. Karen, of course, saw herself as the victim. She was a martyr, a defender of property values, a lone warrior standing against the forces of chaos and curb ramps. She gave tearful interviews to the local news, claiming that Jack was a menace to the community, a troublemaker who was single-handedly destroying the idyllic tranquility of Pleasant Hollow. "He's turning our neighborhood into a zoo," she wailed, dabbing her eyes with a Kleenex. "The squirrels are running rampant, the polka music is deafening, and the gnome... Oh, the gnome! It's an abomination." The media ate it up. Pleasant Hollow became a national laughingstock, a symbol of the absurd pettiness and escalating conflicts that plague suburban America. Meanwhile, the HOA meetings were becoming increasingly chaotic. Jack started attending them, wheelchair and all, accompanied by Sarah and a gaggle of reporters eager to capture the spectacle. He would sit in the back, a mischievous glint in his eye, occasionally lobbing sarcastic comments at Karen and the board. "So, about that gnome," he'd say, interrupting a heated debate about the acceptable shade of beige for garage doors. "Is there a specific clause in the CC and RS that prohibits gnomes of a certain height? Because I'm pretty sure mine is only like half an inch over the limit." Karen would practically explode with rage, her face turning a shade of red that clashed horribly with her perfectly coordinated outfit. She tried to have Jack ejected from the meetings, but Sarah would calmly point out that, as a homeowner, he had a right to attend and voice his concerns. But the real fireworks started when Jack decided to run for a seat on the HOA board. The very idea of it sent shivers down Karen's spine. If Jack managed to get elected, he could dismantle the entire HOA from the inside, tearing down the carefully constructed edifice of rules and regulations she'd spent years building. She launched a smear campaign, spreading rumors about Jack's radical agenda and his supposed plan to turn Pleasant Hollow into a hippie commune, filled with unkempt lawns and tie-dye curtains. She even circulated a doctored photo of Jack wearing a beret and holding a sign that said, "Down with beige." Jack, of course, embraced the absurdity. He ran on a platform of gnome rights, squirrel liberation, and polka for all. He promised to abolish the most ridiculous HOA rules, to promote diversity and inclusivity, and to make Pleasant Hollow a place where everyone felt welcome, regardless of their disability, their musical tastes, or their fondness for garden gnomes. The election was a nail-biter. Karen and her cronies pulled out all the stops, stuffing ballot boxes, intimidating voters, and even resorting to outright voter suppression. But Jack's message resonated with many of the residents who were tired of Karen's tyranny and longed for a more relaxed and tolerant community. In the end, Jack won by a landslide. The Beige Brigade was defeated. The reign of Karen was over. But Karen wasn't ready to give up. She refused to accept the results of the election, claiming that it was rigged, that Jack had cheated, that the squirrels had somehow influenced the outcome. She filed a lawsuit, demanding a recount and accusing Jack of voter fraud. While the legal wrangling continued, Karen hatched a plan. A scheme so audacious, so petty, so utterly Karen-esque that it defied all logic and reason. She decided to take her revenge on Jack's property. Literally. One night, under the cover of darkness, she snuck onto Jack's lawn, armed with a pair of garden shears, a can of neon pink spray paint, and a burning desire to inflict some serious horticultural damage. Her target? The offending curb ramp. Her goal was simple: to vandalize the ramp in such a way that it would be unusable, an eyesore, and a testament to Jack's failure to conform to the aesthetic standards of Pleasant Hollow. She started by hacking away at the ramp's edges with the garden shears, creating jagged, uneven surfaces that would be difficult for a wheelchair to navigate. Then, she unleashed the neon pink spray paint, covering the ramp with graffiti, crude slogans, misspelled insults, and a series of disturbing drawings of gnomes being tortured. But Karen, in her vengeful frenzy, failed to notice one crucial detail. Jack had installed a security camera overlooking his front yard, and the camera was recording everything. As she was putting the finishing touches on her masterpiece of vandalism, the camera's motion sensor activated, triggering a series of spotlights that illuminated the entire scene. Karen, caught in the glare, froze like a deer in headlights. And that's when the sprinklers came on. Jack, anticipating that Karen might try something stupid, had reprogrammed his sprinkler system to activate whenever the security camera detected motion. The sprinklers, set to maximum power, unleashed a torrent of water that drenched Karen from head to toe, washing away her makeup, ruining her hair, and turning her into a shivering, neon pink mess. As Karen stood there, soaked and humiliated, Jack rolled out onto his porch, a triumphant grin on his face. He raised his tea mug in a mock salute. "Good evening, Karen," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Enjoying the midnight manicure? The game, it seemed, was far from over. But for now, at least, Jack had scored a major victory in the ongoing war against Karen and the Beige Brigade. And the best part? He had it all on video. The revenge was getting sweeter by the minute. The video of Karen's midnight manicure incident went viral faster than a cat riding a Roomba. It was shared, memed, and parroted to death. Karen became an internet sensation, albeit for all the wrong reasons. She was dubbed Neon Karen, Sprinkler Karen, and Jack's personal favorite, the Gnome Abuser. Humiliated and enraged, Karen filed a lawsuit against Jack, claiming invasion of privacy, defamation, and emotional distress. She argued that the security camera was an illegal surveillance device, that the video was doctored, and that Jack had deliberately set her up to humiliate her. Jack, of course, denied all the allegations. He claimed that the security camera was necessary for his personal safety, that the video was authentic, and that Karen had only herself to blame for her predicament. He countersued for harassment, discrimination, and the cost of repairing the damage to his curb ramp. The legal battle escalated into a media frenzy. The local news stations camped out in front of Pleasant Hollow, eager to capture every twist and turn in the saga. Talk shows invited Jack and Karen to debate their differences on national television, resulting in shouting matches that were more entertaining than informative. Meanwhile, the HOA was in complete disarray. The board members were at each other's throats, blaming Karen for the negative publicity and demanding her resignation. Karen, however, refused to step down. She clung to her position like a drowning woman clinging to a life raft, determined to fight to the bitter end. As the legal battles raged on, the war on the ground continued. Jack and Karen engaged in a series of increasingly bizarre and petty acts of retaliation. Jack started planting flowers in his front yard, but not just any flowers. He planted sunflowers, towering behemoths that blocked Karen's view of the street and cast a perpetual shadow over her perfectly manicured lawn. He also installed a bird feeder, attracting flocks of pigeons that descended on Karen's property like a biblical plague. Karen retaliated by hiring a landscaping company to transform her yard into a fortress of hedges, a green wall designed to shield her from Jack's gaze and block out the sound of his polka music. She also started leaving anonymous notes on Jack's doorstep, filled with cryptic threats and misspelled insults. But the most audacious act of revenge came in the form of a lawn gnome. Karen replaced her collection of ordinary garden gnomes with a single, menacing gnome that was almost life-sized. This was no ordinary gnome, mind you. This gnome was armed. It held a miniature shotgun in its lap and had a scowl on its face that could curdle milk. Jack found the gnome hilarious. He even started referring to it as Gnomezilla and would often wave to it as he passed by in his wheelchair. But Karen had a more sinister plan in mind. She rigged the gnome with a motion sensor and a hidden speaker that played a recording of her voice screaming, "Get off my lawn," whenever anyone approached it. She also replaced the gnome's shotgun with a real, loaded firearm. One evening, as Jack was returning home from a doctor's appointment, he noticed that the gnome was pointing directly at him. He chuckled to himself, assuming it was just another one of Karen's silly pranks. But as he got closer, he heard a click, and the gnome's speaker blared, "Get off my lawn." At the same time, the gnome's shotgun discharged, sending a blast of buckshot whizzing past Jack's head. Jack ducked for cover, his heart pounding in his chest. He realized that Karen had gone too far. This was no longer a petty feud. This was attempted murder. He immediately called the police, who arrived on the scene with sirens blaring. They arrested Karen, confiscated the gnome, and launched a full-scale investigation. The news of the armed gnome incident sent shockwaves through Pleasant Hollow and beyond. Even the most jaded news anchors couldn't help but chuckle at the absurdity of it all. Karen was charged with attempted assault, reckless endangerment, and a host of other felonies. She was facing years in prison and a mountain of legal fees. As she was being led away in handcuffs, she turned to Jack and screamed, "This isn't over. I'll get you for this. I'll make you pay." Jack just smiled and shook his head. He knew that Karen was cornered, desperate, and dangerous, but he also knew that he had finally won. He had exposed her for what she was, a petty, vindictive tyrant who was willing to do anything to get her way. But he also knew that the battle wasn't truly over until he was able to dismantle the entire HOA and create a community where everyone felt welcome and respected. And that was a challenge that he was more than ready to take on. The climax was building, and Jack was ready to meet it head-on, wheelchair and all. The armed gnome incident proved to be the final nail in Karen's coffin. Facing serious jail time and mounting legal bills, she was forced to resign from the HOA in disgrace. The remaining board members, terrified of being associated with her madness, quickly distanced themselves from her and begged Jack to forgive them for their past transgressions. With Karen out of the picture, Jack seized the opportunity to dismantle the HOA from the inside. He called a special meeting, packed the room with his supporters, including a surprising number of squirrel enthusiasts, and proposed a complete overhaul of the HOA's rules and regulations. He abolished the most ridiculous restrictions, such as the height limit for gnomes, the acceptable shade of beige for garage doors, and the ban on polka music. He introduced new rules promoting diversity, inclusivity, and respect for people with disabilities. He even proposed a measure that would require the HOA to provide funding for curb ramps and other accessibility improvements for all residents who needed them. The changes were approved overwhelmingly. The Beige Brigade was routed. The HOA was transformed from a tyrannical regime into a democratic organization that actually served the interests of the community. But Jack wasn't content with just reforming the HOA. He wanted to make sure that Karen paid for her crimes. He testified against her at her trial, painting a vivid picture of her harassment, discrimination, and attempted assault. He even presented the video of the midnight manicure incident as evidence, much to the amusement of the jury. The jury found Karen guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, fined a hefty sum, and ordered to undergo anger management therapy. She was also banned from ever serving on an HOA board again. As she was being led away to prison, she glared at Jack and spat, "You haven't heard the last of me, Jack. I'll get my revenge someday." Jack just smiled and waved. He knew that Karen was a broken woman, consumed by hatred and bitterness. He felt a twinge of pity for her, but he also knew that she had brought it all on herself. With Karen behind bars and the HOA under new management, Pleasant Hollow began to transform. The lawns became less manicured, the houses became more colorful, and the sound of polka music filled the air. Squirrels roamed freely, gnomes stood proudly on front lawns, and everyone felt welcome, regardless of their background or their abilities. Jack became a local hero. He was hailed as a champion of disability rights, a defender of individual freedom, and a thorn in the side of oppressive bureaucracies everywhere. He received awards, gave speeches, and even wrote a book about his experiences, which became a bestseller. But the greatest reward of all was the peace of mind that came from knowing that he had stood up for what was right and had made a difference in the lives of others. And as for Karen, well, she spent her time in prison plotting her revenge, writing angry letters to the HOA, and practicing her gnome carving skills in the prison woodshop. She vowed to return to Pleasant Hollow someday and reclaim her rightful place as the queen bee. But that, my friends, is a story for another time. For now, let's just celebrate Jack's victory. He had faced down a tyrant, reformed a broken system, and created a community where everyone could thrive. He had proven that even a wheelchair-bound veteran could take on the forces of darkness and win. And to top it all off, the HOA, in a gesture of goodwill, designated a special parking spot right in front of Jack's house, just for him. It was painted bright blue and had a sign that read, "Reserved for the wheelchair warrior." Jack couldn't help but smile as he parked his wheelchair in the spot. He had won the war, he had gotten his revenge, and he had a front-row seat to the polka revolution that was sweeping through Pleasant Hollow. The end? Perhaps. But the legend of Jack, the wheelchair warrior, will live on forever. And that's all, folks. I hope you enjoyed this wild ride through the wacky world of suburban warfare. If you did, please give this video a big thumbs up. Don't forget to share this video with your friends and family who need a good laugh, or who have ever had to deal with a crazy HOA. And most importantly, please subscribe to my channel for more hilarious stories, outrageous characters, and satirical takes on modern life. Thanks for watching, and remember, never underestimate the power of a wheelchair, a good lawyer, and a well-placed garden gnome. Peace out.